Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Mark Esper, our nation's 27th Secretary of Defense, is with us. During the stormy 16 months he served in the Trump cabinet, he often clashed with the president, who wanted to use the military in ways Esper thought were inappropriate. Trump fired Esper in November 2020, a few days after he lost the election. Secretary Esper elaborates the time he held office in his book, A Sacred Oath, Memoirs of a Secretary of Defense in Extraordinary Times. In the Wall Street Journal, former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton wrote, "A sacred oath is not a gratuitous tell-all, it is a work of history." And the Manchester Guardian critic said, "A sacred oath pulls no punches. It depicts Trump as unfit for office and a threat to democracy, a prisoner of wrath, impulse, and appetite. It is scary and sobering." We're both honored and pleased to welcome Mark Esper to the program. So Mark, congratulations on your book. It really was a thrilling read. And I'll ask you, well, what led you to write a book about your time in office as Secretary of Defense?
Well, first of all, thanks, Jim. It's great to be with you and to speak with you again. So I wrote the book for a number of reasons. First and foremost, I thought it was very important for the American people to understand the history of the country during this very unprecedented, momentous time, if you will, which was the Trump administration, and in particular, the last 18 months or so that I served as Secretary of Defense during that time. Secondly, I wrote it because I thought it was important to give some insights to people currently in government or who aspire to serve in government. And then third, I wanted to speak to the military audience as well. So this is really a book about my tenure at DOD as Secretary of the Army and as Secretary of Defense. I'd never portrayed it as a Trump book, if you will, but more my recollections, my insights, what I was thinking and going through, my victories and failures, if you will, as well.
Now, when you took office, and you took office after being confirmed by a 90-8 vote in the United States Senate, you said that you would be apolitical. Did you view your obligation as an obligation of loyalty to the president who appointed you, or did you feel you had another obligation?
Well, my first obligation was always to the Constitution. That's the oath, hence the title of my book. That's where you swear your loyalty to. And I had taken that oath multiple times over the years during both my time in military service, going back to the age of 18, and of course, through my government service. But, look, that said, you do owe a certain amount of loyalty to the president. You owe a certain amount of loyalty to the people who serve for you, to the institution of the Department of Defense, and to others, not least of which, of course, is the American people. So I write about all these things and how I thought through different issues and challenges and put them in what I thought was the appropriate order as I tried to guide my decision making.
Now, when you took office, did you think you'd have a particularly hard time? Your predecessor, Jim Mattis, Trump said he was fired, Mattis said he resigned, but they certainly clashed over policy. What was your take on the challenges of dealing with the president as Secretary of Defense?
Well, I thought it certainly would be challenging. He had proven already to be a unique president, if you will. But I'd served for nearly 2 years as Secretary of the Army. I knew my way around government. I'd served at the Pentagon 4 times previously. I served on Capitol Hill. I served on industry. So I thought I was fairly well prepared to do the job. When I'd met with the president or spoke to him on previous occasions, I was fairly clear about where I was on certain issues such as NATO. But I didn't anticipate what would happen in 2020. And as I write in the book, the Trump had taken the job to a new level, if you will, in terms of once he had beaten impeachment. He brought fresh troops in to pursue some of his more unusual ideas, if you will. And it got really crazy in different ways. And I talk about this, but it was a new normal. And it was something that I realized in June of that year for certain, and something I had to navigate in my final months in office.
Well, of course, it's not unusual for secretaries of defense to clash with the presidents who appoint them. Jim Schlesinger was fired by Gerald Ford because of differences over policy and failures to carry out presidential directives. Cap Weinberger was almost fired by Ronald Reagan for failing to carry out presidential directives. At least that's what George Shultz thought he ought to be fired. So you readied yourself, didn't you, for this kind of environment?
Oh, sure. Look, I was familiar with the history of secretaries of defense. You mentioned two. I mean, there were others, of course, who fired or were forced out. And what I had decided was I had no problem being fired. I just wanted to be fired for the right reasons and for the right circumstances. And I didn't want to walk away either. I didn't want to be pushed out because certainly in the final 6-7 months of my tenure, after what happened on June 1st in Washington, D.C. and everything else, I knew that I thought the higher calling, my higher duty was to stay and try to do a number of things. First of all, continue to advance an agenda within the Pentagon based on the National Defense Strategy that said China was our top threat and we need to prepare for that in the years ahead. And then secondly, outside the Pentagon, I would play defense against some of the kooky ideas of the president's advisors or some of the other things that he was putting forward to try and hold things together, at least until the election, until the American people decided on who they wanted for their next president. And that became my game plan for the final 6 or 7 months of my tenure.
Now, during the time that you were in office, you write in your book that you were deeply troubled by some extraordinary issues that you had with Donald Trump. Can you tell us about some of those?
Of course, in early 2020, he talked about bombing Iranian cultural and historic sites, which I thought would violate the laws of warfare and our own professional ethic. And then when we head into the summer and spring, again, constantly questions raised about offensive operations against Venezuela. We have the story I tell about his advisor, Stephen Miller, suggesting that we send 250,000 troops to the border. And then the president raises on a couple of questions this notion of attacking the cartels in Mexico, shooting missiles at them and knocking out the drug factory. So, look, these things continue. There's more I outline in my book, but that's what convinced me I needed to stay to push back on these bad ideas.
Well, he wanted to shoot missiles into Mexico in a way that it would never be known that the United States was the one who had launched the missiles.
Yeah, right. It was ludicrous to think that we would launch missiles and nobody would know it was us. I mean, we're probably the only country in the world capable of doing such a thing. So.
Now, you faulted him for wanting to send 250,000 troops to the border because Biden recently sent 1,500 troops to the border, or said he was going to, because of a surge in immigration. Was there something wrong with sending 250,000 troops to the border? Is it the number of troops, or is it using troops for that purpose?
Well, it was certainly the number of troops. And look, we've been supporting the Department of Homeland Security since the Bush administration. Bush did it, Obama did it, Trump did it, Biden's doing it, and it's not unusual. I'd been there through those as working in Congress and, of course, working in the government. So that was not unusual. In fact, during my tenure, we deployed a few thousand troops to the border as well to support DHS in an administrative and logistical role, much like they're planning on doing today. So that was not the issue. The issue was 250,000 combat troops to the border, first of which we didn't have, and secondly, would be a tremendous waste of resources. And then third, of course, it would undermine our national security because I would have to draw those forces from somewhere else, and that would affect our readiness. So it was just a ridiculous idea set up to deal with the alleged caravans that were coming north that never really materialized, at least in the numbers that some people were saying within the White House.
All right, now then you had another issue, which was after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, there were protests across the nation, and there were protests in Washington, there were protests in Portland, Oregon. What was Trump's reaction to the protests?
Well, he was very upset about them, outraged, particularly the ones in Washington, D.C. He thought that they undermined the United States on the world stage. They made him look bad. They made the country look bad. And of course, that's what led to the infamous meeting in the White House on Monday, June 1st of 2020, where he pressed me and General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to send 10,000 troops or be prepared to send 10,000 troops into the city to deal with protesters. And fortunately, that didn't happen because we, along with Bill Barr, pushed back pretty mightily on it.
Did he say something about shooting protesters in the legs?
Yeah, at one point he looked at the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it was a question. It was a suggestion in the form of a question where he said something along the lines of, "Well, can't you just shoot them? Can't you just shoot them in the legs or something?" And his idea was to bring in troops, shoot the protesters. That would quell the riots. It would send them fleeing, and it would send a message not just to D.C. but also to Portland and Chicago and other places where people were protesting.
Now, when he sent that, did you think about the Kent State incident in the 1960s?
Well, yes. I mean, we were all aghast by the suggestion, and I don't remember those times exactly at Kent State, but I've read enough about it. I've seen the films, and I knew what it would do to the country. I knew what it would do to the military as an institution, and in particular, our relationship with the American people. So, look, it was a bad idea all the way around, and what we continued to do instead was to push him to deploy law enforcement because it was a law enforcement issue. And to the degree that Bill Barr, the AG, needed additional forces, if you will, I offered up the National Guard as a supporting entity that would guard federal buildings and do those types of things, but would not engage the protesters.
What was the level of violence in Washington and around the country among the protesters?
Well, it was there, but it was a minority. Of course, in D.C. in the nights leading up to June 1st, we had buildings set afire, vandalism that damaged buildings and cars and private property. We had Secret Service and National Guard troops hurt seriously. And so there was violence, but not to the scale that demanded, frankly, bringing in troops en masse. What it required was law enforcement. Working closely between the D.C. Police Department and federal law enforcement to ensure that people could protest. Because, look, you have a First Amendment right to protest, to speak, but you have to do so peacefully. And the purpose would have been to make sure they could do so peacefully, and peaceful protesters were not harmed or caught up in any type of activity by the violent protesters.
Now, on June 1, 2020, something else happened. Can you tell us about that? You accompanied the president on a walk.
Yeah, well, I'm heading down to the FBI headquarters downtown the late afternoon, early evening of June 1st. Milley's already down there, and we get called back to the White House around 6:20 or so because we're told the president wants an update on what is going to happen that day. So my convoy turns back around. We hustle down to the White House. I arrive outside the Oval Office and announce that I'm here and ready for the meeting. And I'm told the meeting's canceled. There will not be a meeting. So my inclination is to go back out and prepare for what was going to happen that night because it was very uncertain. And we had National Guard troops there. And I wanted to be present and make sure everybody was ready. But I was told, no, just hang around. The president is going to want to go check out the damage at the church, and we'll probably invite you to join him. So we wait. We realize that the president is speaking at that point in time to the press and another part of the White House complex. Eventually it ends. We get lined up, and we're told, go meet the president at the other end of the White House. And when we get there, I say to him, Mr. President, where are we going? What are we doing? Something to that effect. And he pretty much turns and starts walking and tells us to follow him. And next thing you know, we found ourselves walking outside the gate. We turn into a crowd of reporters, photographers, and we realize at that moment it's a political event that we should not have been in, but are trapped nonetheless in this entourage leading its way into Lafayette Park up to the church that was vandalized.
Now, General Milley was not dressed in a dress uniform, was he? He was in combat fatigues.
Yeah, something that he, I'm sure, regrets to this day. But he was preparing for a long night out on the streets, and so it changed into something more comfortable when he was called back. And so he caught himself in his camouflage fatigues, if you will, walking, which added to the image, if you will, of the event being politicized and the Department of Defense being caught up in it.
So when that happened, did you feel the president was using you improperly?
Oh yeah, we knew immediately that this was not a situation for us to be in, that we were being used in this situation. And it became even more apparent as things settled down on the streets that night, and General Milley and I had a chance to reflect on the day, and certainly in the days following. It's that and other reasons that prompted me to stand before the nation on the morning of June 3rd, Wednesday, 2 days later, and announce that I did not support invocation of the Insurrection Act, and express my regrets as well for being in Lafayette Park at that moment, because I'd worked pretty hard through my, at that point, well over a year in office, to be apolitical, to stay out of politics and things like that, and been fairly successful. But this was not a good look. It was not a place to be. And I expressed my regret. General Milley did a couple weeks later after that. And it was an important lesson for all of us with regard to what happened that week.
Did you or General Milley at that point contemplate resignation?
Yes. I mean, I certainly did. I'm sure it was going through his mind at all. But it was at that point, though, as we thought through it, we realized, look, if we resigned, or at least I'll speak for myself, if I resigned, I was confident that the president would put in a yes man, so to speak, who would act on some of these fanciful ideas that he and others were putting forward, whether it was shooting missiles into Mexico or 250,000 troops to the border, or combat operations against Venezuela, or attacking Iran. I wanted to be there to push back on those things. And I had no confidence that somebody coming in behind me would do such a thing. So I made the decision to stay, not resign, and stay and continue to play what I call the inside game of advancing the agenda within the Pentagon and pushing back outside against bad White House ideas. I knew it would come at some sacrifice to me. I would take a lot of heat from the media and others, but I thought it was the right thing to do, the more important thing to do.
You mentioned the Insurrection Act. The president wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act. What was the issue there?
Well, so the Insurrection Act allows the president then to call active duty troops into any city in the United States.
Martial law, in effect.
In many ways, yes, and override the desires of the governors. And so it's a fast pass, if you will, to doing that and really tamping down hard on the protests. And that was what concerned me, was I did not want to use, and didn't think we needed to use, active duty troops. That's not their role or function. It would take us to a terrible place, if you will, as a country historically, civil relations, et cetera. If there was to be a role for the Guard, as I argued often internally, it would be, for the military, it would be to use the National Guard under the orders of the governors in their traditional support role. And that's eventually what we did in a few cities, and that was the right way to support law enforcement.
And you really publicly broke with the president when you made the statements that you did not support the invocation of the Insurrection Act.
Yeah, and it ended up in a heated argument right afterward with him in the White House, and where he alleged a number of things, and I pushed back. But look, my point was I wanted to make clear that DOD was working hard to remain apolitical and express my views as the civilian head of the Department of Defense, because this was a civilian issue, not a military issue. A civilian issue, to state clearly what I thought the proper role of the military was in society, and what we should be doing at this moment in time. And so that's why I felt it important to stand up and say that publicly, at some risk to myself, of course, but I thought it was the right thing to do.
So as you continued in office, another issue arose about the politicization of the military, and that had to do with the promotion of Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, of course, the Colonel Vindman's tale goes all the way back to the infamous phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine in, I think, June of 2019, where he's pushing him to investigate the Bidens, as I recall. It seems like a lifetime ago now. But anyways, at some point, of course, Vindman comes forward. He testifies before Congress. He challenges the appropriateness of Trump's phone call, and that put him on the hit list, if you will, and really struck the ire of President Trump, unlike anybody else. And so Trump eventually, through his national security advisor, fired Alexander Vindman from the National Security Council staff where he worked a few months ahead of his departure anyways, but then took it to a new level where he began pressing me to basically not make sure he wasn't promoted, if not push him out of the military. And that's kind of where I felt that had gone way beyond what should be done. Look, it's the president has the right to put on his national security staff who he wants and doesn't want. That's one thing, but you don't get the chance to reach into the military promotion system and deny somebody an earned promotion. And that was another line I had to draw between the president and the Department of Defense that I was willing to defend. And ultimately, what I did was inform the White House that I wasn't going to take Vindman off the promotion list, and had begun the process of sending the names forward, when at the same time, Colonel Vindman surprised us all by resigning. But that was leading to another showdown with the White House over the president's willingness to politicize the military, and in this case, with a young officer.
Didn't you, while this was going on, have Vindman re-investigated and to see whether there was a basis for his promotion?
Well, he never was investigated, if you will, by the White House.
Performance review.
Well, but the investigation or inquiry, if you will, was important because there were allegations made about him by folks in the White House that he wasn't being honest and things like that. And I had challenged the White House staff and the president to bring me something because, look, I and Millie and others, and we had been through this during our careers, both in the military and as civilians, or at least for me as a civilian, that if you have an allegation, you're duty bound to investigate it, to be fair to the officer and those the people making the allegation. But I would challenge them to bring the information, and we'll take a look into it. And they never really could or did. There was a feeble attempt at the end, and we quickly had the Army IG look into it and found that there was nothing there with regard to Colonel Vindman's performance. And so I felt we had done our due diligence, if you will, and cleared him and cleared his name through the established process. And so anyways, that was kind of where we followed the Army processes, the way the military does something. And Vindman came up clean, if you will. And there was no bounds whatsoever, no basis whatsoever to deny him an earned promotion.
Hasn't this military promotions issue resurfaced since you left office, with Senator Tuberville holding up military promotions because of his claim that the military has been soft on abortion policy? And you and former secretaries of defense have gone on record as pushing back against him for that.
Right. Just last week, 6 or 7 of us wrote a bipartisan letter, if you will, saying that it's wrong to put blanket holds on military officers. In this case, the senator held up nearly 200 general and flag officers because he disagrees with the Pentagon's approach on abortion policy and how to take care of women's reproductive rights in the military. So our argument was that these military leaders are simply executing the policy decisions made by their civilian leaders. They don't have a say in this. Their duty is to obey what their civilian leaders tell them to do, assuming it's legal and ethical and moral. So anyways, that was our pushback. Now, look, the senator isn't the first one. Senator Duckworth of Illinois held up over 1,000 officers over the Vindman issue, officers who were supposed to be promoted as well. And our argument was, look, no, it's been done in the past by both parties. Nobody should do it. We should not subject military officers, people who are going up for promotion or a reassignment, should not be held politically captive or hostages to a political process.
Now, the 25th Amendment to the Constitution provides for certain cabinet checks on the conduct of the president. Did you ever consider conferring with your cabinet colleagues about invoking, or any of them, about invoking the 25th Amendment with regard to Donald Trump?
No, that never came up during my time. It was never discussed. Of course, the 25th is fairly narrow, as I recall. It talks about incapacitants, but it never came up during my tenure. There was, of course, we know now that maybe there was some discussion after the events of January 6, 2021, but I had been 2 months out of office at that time.
Okay, now Donald Trump is seeking re-election. Would you vote for him again?
No, I've said this a number of times over the past year or so that I think he's unfit to be president. and should not be president. So I hope that the Republican Party will find a new standard bearer, a conservative Republican who can bring the party together, can grow the party, and can win elections. And Trump can't do that. By the way, I hope we see a new standard bearer from the Democratic side as well. I think we need a new generation of leaders from both parties to come forward. I think it's overdue, and I think it would help our country move forward.
A new generation of leaders. Well, this has been just marvelous, and we've run out of time. There are many, many other questions I would ask you, but Mark Esper, thank you for coming by. Thank you for your service to your country. I think it's 21 years of public service, just remarkable. You saw combat in the Gulf War. You graduated from West Point. You were a Secretary of the Army, and you've served the country in so many ways, and a grateful nation salutes you.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it. It was great talking with you.
Great talking with you. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Be well, take care, and all the best.